Welcome back to the Deep Dive, everybody. Today we're going to be doing a deep dive into one scholar who basically reshaped an entire field of study.
Yeah, that's right.
We're talking about Jacob Neusner. And his work, we're talking Jewish studies, his work basically fundamentally changed how this is approached in universities.
For sure, yeah.
And to put it in perspective, we're talking like nearly 1,000 books published.
It's a crazy amount of work, yeah.
I mean, like, how do you even, like, I don't even know where you would begin.
So that's our mission today, right?
Yeah.
I think that is our mission.
Yeah, I think our mission for this deep dive is to, like, not get overwhelmed by the sheer volume of stuff, but to kind of, like, pull out, like, the essential...
The nuggets.
Yeah, the nuggets of knowledge and impact and figure out, like, why does he matter? What did he do that was so important?
Exactly.
So I think one of the most sort of foundational things that people talk about with Neusner is just making these crucial rabbinic texts accessible through his translations. Yeah. So, I mean, like the Mishnah,
yeah,
a new translation was a real turning point.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think if you think about it before Neusner, a lot of people were really only looking at the Mishnah as a legal text. Like it was just a collection of laws. And he came along and really like this form analytical approach that he's known for, you know, it's like he came in like an architect and looked at the structure of the book.
Oh, wow.
Rather than just the content.
So like seeing like the blueprints beyond the individual bricks.
Exactly.
That makes a lot of sense.
So it's not just about rules and regulations. It's about, you know, trying to understand the intellectual system at play.
Yeah, so like what are they trying to actually build with all these laws?
Totally. Yeah. And he has this book too, the Mishnah, an introduction, which I think is really helpful for seeing this new way of understanding the Mishnah.
Okay. And then he took on, I mean, these are massive undertakings, but translating the Babylonian and Jerusalem Talmuds, I mean, these are just huge projects.
Projects, yeah.
How did that shift things in the field?
I think in a big way, because it really opened up these texts to a much wider audience. I mean, before, if you weren't someone who could read Hebrew and Aramaic,
right,
you know, these texts were just closed off to you. And I mean, centuries of rabbinic thought and debate and all that sort of thing, suddenly it was like this library was opened up.
And accessible, right?
Exactly.
To scholars from different backgrounds.
Yeah. And you know, it's not just the Talmud. He also did a lot of work on Midrash, you know, so rabbinic biblical interpretation, you know, providing frameworks for understanding Midrash. He wrote a book called Midrash, an introduction, another one called What is Midrash, and even translated the Tosefta, which is another important rabbinic text.
Oh, okay. I've heard of that one.
Yeah. So it's like he's really opening up I don't know, it's like this whole world of Jewish text study to people.
Right, so it wasn't just like making it readable in English.
Yeah.
He was bringing new ways to analyze and approach these texts.
Yep.
So like form criticism.
Yeah, form criticism. I mean, you know, but basically what you're doing is you're looking at these smaller units of text, right?
Okay.
And trying to figure out, okay, what was their original form? What was their setting? What was their purpose?
Is it like a sentence or a paragraph?
Yeah, it could even be like a whole story or saying, but yeah, like smaller units within the larger text.
Okay.
And Neusner, I mean, he really applied this to rabbinic texts, and especially the Mishnah, trying to uncover the underlying logic, the patterns beneath the surface. It's like...
so not just what they're saying, but how they're saying it.
Exactly. And also, like, why are they saying it this way? You know, what's the purpose of structuring it this way?
Yeah.
It's like if you think of, like, a really complex dish,
right?
You know, you've got all these different ingredients, you've got the cooking techniques, and form criticism is kind of like breaking down that dish into its individual elements, you know? So you can really understand how it all comes together.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And what about redaction criticism? So what did that tell us about the text?
Yeah, so with redaction criticism, you know, imagine you have like a book and it's got all these different authors who contributed to it. Mm-hmm. And then you have an editor who comes along and kind of weaves it all together.
Right.
And they do that with their own like message or their own focus.
Okay.
So redaction criticism is basically looking at how the editors shaped these rabbinic texts.
The final form.
Yeah, the final form, exactly. So we're talking the Mishnah, the Talmuds, the Midrash collections. Neusner's argument was that, you know, each one of these has its own distinct editor, its own distinct focus.
So almost like a distinct voice.
Yeah, a distinct voice, exactly. And this really challenged the idea that there's like one unified Judaism behind all these texts.
Which had been like the prevailing thought before that.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I think a lot of people had this idea that, you know, there's this one monolithic Judaism, And Neusner's like, no, 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 no. There are multiple voices, multiple perspectives. You have to understand them within their own context.
That seems like a really major change, right? Like how scholars were understanding what Judaism even is.
It's huge. I mean, I think it's transformative for the field. And, I think what's also really interesting is that Neusner, he was really insistent on bringing in rigorous academic methods,
Okay.
similar to what was being done in biblical studies. So, form criticism, redaction criticism, source criticism, all these things that were being used to study the Bible.
Which people would have considered to be a more legitimate academic topic at that time.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so Neusner's saying, no, no, we need to do the same with rabbinic texts. Understand their literary context, understand their historical context, understand all these things. And that really helped, I think, integrate Jewish studies into secular universities.
Where it hadn't really been before.
Yeah, not in the same way.
And do you think his own background had anything to do with that? I mean, I've heard that, he didn't come from a super traditional Jewish background, right?
Yeah, he was like a suburban Jew, so maybe he had a little bit of a fresh perspective on things.
Like not coming in with any sort of preconceived notions.
Could be, yeah. I mean, of course, a figure like this, someone so groundbreaking.
Right.
He wasn't without his critics, right?
Yeah, of course not. Everybody's going to have their critics. We've heard a little bit about Saul Lieberman.
Yeah, Saul Lieberman, I mean, he was this really renowned Talmudist.
Okay.
And he had some pretty strong disagreements with Neusner, particularly about his translation of the Jerusalem Talmud.
Okay.
He really questioned Neusner's linguistic abilities, thought that maybe he wasn't quite up to the task.
So some more traditional scholars were pushing back a little.
Yeah, and it wasn't just Lieberman. There were others who questioned, whether Neusner's assumptions about the text were maybe leading him to certain interpretations.
Kind of like influencing the results of his own work.
Yeah, potentially, And then, of course, some of his conclusions were just really controversial.
Okay.
Like his view on messianism in rabbinic Judaism, I mean, that sparked a lot of debate.
And we'll get into that in another deep dive.
Yeah, we could do a whole deep dive on that. Yeah.
But he was also very interested in the historical and social world behind all these writings, wasn't he?
For sure, yeah.
Like his work on the Jews in Babylonia, I mean, that sounds really insightful.
Yeah, yeah. So, he wrote this 5-volume history of the Jews in Babylonia. And, what he did was he really placed the Babylonian Talmud firmly within its Iranian context.
So looking at the influences of the surrounding Persian culture.
Exactly. He's emphasizing that these texts are products of their time and place.
Not just abstract ideas, right?
Totally. They reflect daily life. They reflect worldviews. They reflect the social and political realities of the people who created them.
Yeah, and he even proposed that there was this really significant shift
Right.
in Judaism between the Mishnaic period and the Talmudic period, based on all this analysis.
Yeah, that's a really interesting argument.
Which is fascinating. We can get into that.
Another time.
Another time.
But yeah, I think he's really trying to understand these texts as living documents,
Okay. That makes sense.
Not just these static things from the past.
Yeah, not just relics behind glass in a museum.
Exactly.
So we've talked a lot about his scholarship and his methods, but he was also involved in interfaith dialogue too, wasn't he? Particularly with his book, A Rabbi Talks with Jesus.
Yeah, yeah. He did a lot of work, particularly on Judaism and early Christianity.
Okay.
So, you mentioned A Rabbi Talks with Jesus. I think the goal there was really to promote understanding.
Between Jews and Christians?
Yeah. He was taking this comparative approach, trying to see the commonalities and differences between the two faiths.
So almost like a model for interfaith dialogue.
Totally. And there's this really interesting quote from him where he talks about Judaism as being, quote, not particular, but exemplary.
That's a really good quote.
Yeah, I think, he's trying to say that Judaism, it's not just about particular rules or rituals. It's about offering a model, an exemplary model for how to live a meaningful life in relationship with God.
So when we look at specific areas within Judaism, like Jewish law, Jewish theology, Jewish narrative, how did Neusner's work have an impact on those?
Yeah. I mean, in Jewish law, halakha, he argued that there is an inherent theology embedded within the legal discussions themselves.
So he was even finding theology in the most seemingly dry legal stuff?
Exactly, yeah.
That's interesting.
And he even wrote this big encyclopedia, the halakha. an encyclopedia of the law of Judaism.
Another massive project.
Another massive project, yeah.
Oh my gosh.
And then, in theology, he wrote books like The Theology of the Oral Torah and Handbook of Rabbinic Theology. I mean, he was really exploring core theological concepts. And again, not afraid to offer some controversial views.
Like on Messianism.
Like on Messianism, yeah. And then in Jewish narrative tradition, so Agadah.
The stories and stuff.
Yeah, the stories, the parables, all
yeah.
that. He took this kind of documentary approach,
Okay.
He was really focused on understanding their theological and didactic purposes.
So, like, what are they trying to teach?
Exactly.
Not necessarily, like, whether it happened or not.
Right. He wasn't so concerned with whether these stories were historically accurate or not.
He was looking more at, like, the deeper meaning.
Exactly, yeah.
So it sounds like, regardless of what you think of Neusner, like whether you agree with him or not,
Right.
he fundamentally changed how we even approach studying this stuff.
For sure. I mean, he brought Jewish studies into the academy in a way that it hadn't been before.
And really professionalized it.
Absolutely.
So his translations,
Yep.
his methodologies,
His insistence on rigorous academic analysis,
all of this stuff, like,
it left a lasting impact.
yeah, like this is the water we all swim in now.
Yeah, pretty much. And I think, whether you're a scholar or just someone who's interested in Judaism,
Yeah.
engaging with his work, even if it's critically right,
Yeah.
it's crucial for a deep understanding of Judaism.
So it makes you think, doesn't it?
Mm.
Like, how does this systematic analysis of these ancient texts, the way Neusner did it, how does that reveal not just, like, historical facts, but, like, these deep structures of thought, these belief systems that, like, continue to shape our world today?
It's a great question.
Yeah. And thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
We'll see you all next time.